How do you eradicate extreme poverty? People need the building blocks to lift themselves out of poverty, right? But they also need to make sure the system isn't working against them. The goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 was something that everyone was looking towards, but now we're 7 years in, that goal is wildly off track. And so we asked ourselves, when did it become morally acceptable to assume that 2030 should ever be the goal? Why should the collateral loss of life in the meantime be considered acceptable? And that's why we're launching the End Extreme Poverty Now campaign.
We can't speak about democracy when democracy is silenced. Who are the people that vote these people into power? It is the everyday citizens, it's the everyday people. So of course we have to hold them accountable.
We need to empower girls now, because we know that girls, when fully empowered, have the biggest single opportunity to empower their entire community and lift their communities out of poverty. And by empowerment, we're talking about access to education, food security, water and sanitation, access to reproductive health rights.
I run an organization, the Nomzamo Lighthouse Foundation, and our motto is simple. It's to lift the lid of invisibility. And for a very long time, the girl child has remained invisible. We find that a lot of girls as well do not have the opportunity to finish their studies, especially in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. We say no to that. We want equal education and we want free education, but most importantly, we want access to education.
Before the pandemic, there was almost this inevitability, this sense that, yes, we were going to end extreme poverty by 2030, but the data shows us now that over 100 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty. They've lost their jobs. Some of them aren't able to work anymore because the pandemic shut down their jobs entirely. And so this is really where you've broken that economic cycle of someone's ability to lift themselves out of poverty. As we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, the system can work against people living in extreme poverty. One example of that was vaccine inequity, where wealthier nations hoarded vaccines at the expense of those living in extreme poverty. And that's why we're calling for justice and to make sure we change that system in the future. We actually need to make sure that the world that we're living on is actually sustainable, because there's no point lifting people out of poverty if we've got no planet to live on. And that brings us to the third pillar, which is climate justice now, because we ultimately know that COP26 unfortunately was a failure. The reason why it was a failure is it was a failure of what we call the grand bargain, the bargain between the global south and the global north, where the global north said that they were going to commit $100 billion per year for 5 years so that southern nations would have an opportunity to have an alternative pathway to development that wasn't as coal intensive. But when America walked away from that pledge and other nations, it really made the negotiations fall over, as we saw at COP26. And that's why Global Citizen is calling on that urgent $15 billion funding gap to be fulfilled this year, so that COP27 has a chance to be a success and we can get the climate negotiations back on track.
I absolutely do believe that the opposite of poverty is justice. I think it's important for us to understand that when we continue to want to see the change and make efforts for the change in the world, it's not an act of charity. It is a must. It is justice. That's how we reverse the systemic barriers. That's how we reverse the ills that we get to experience today. It's an act of justice. That's simple.